All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Enoch Aikins, who's a fellow in the Young African Leaders Program in the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Enoch's research focuses on African development and governance. So Enoch, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Ben, for having me. It's a privilege to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm curious, when did you first get interested in development and governance in Africa?
Well, I think it's a question of I've been passionate about development and governance issue right from childhood. Growing up in a place where it's difficult, a poor village in Ghana where it is actually difficult to go to school, and then it's a privilege to go to school and to aspire to greater heights in life. It's natural that you are moved and touched by wanting to see a lot of people being lifted out of development. So I've always had that motive, and I've always had that desire to want to make a change and want to make an impact. But the conflict along the way has been, where is the best place to make an impact? Is it is it to join a political party or to So I've had that conflict. I've actually been a little bit when I was in the university in the political parties, but then later on I find myself working in think tanks and advocating for stuff. And you cannot talk about African development without governance. So you can't separate the two. If you are very passionate about African development, you notice that governance is at the core of our issue. So I guess the two makes up for why I'm so passionate about a development issue in Africa, because every day it's not just knowledge, it's a lived experience. I have families, I have friends, I have people back home that are still not privileged as I am, and still calling you all the time. So when we are talking about issues, we talk about them from experience and lived experience mostly. And then, of course, by the virtue and the privilege of the knowledge that we had, also we speak about some of the issues. So I think that is it for me.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think you raised a really interesting question that I think a lot of people probably should think about more. And that's, what is the best way to impact society? Is it government, as you said, or is it being a part of an organization or a university? What is that debate like then in Africa specifically?
Uh, yeah, well, in Africa, of course, ultimately it's an individual choice on what you are looking for, and then how you want to get things done. I think for me, it is an evolution of stages in life. I won't rule out public sector completely, but I also feel that to be able to serve effectively, you need to understand the issues that you are dealing with. You need to have adequate knowledge. So there are people, of course, my mates in the universities that completed and joined politics. Africa now, politics is a cash cow. If you want to make quick money, you just join a political party, make a lot of noise, and then when your party is in power, or when you are fortunate, and then you get into a position of power, you can, make a lot of money from that. But of course, that is just for yourself, selfish interest.
Right.
And then also, the other thing also is that even if you want to make a change as a young leader or young leader, if the top is very corrupt and the top is not functioning, your impact can be crowded out and you'll be very frustrated. So for me, I think it's a question of, at every given point in time, which area or what is the best strategy for you to make an impact or contribution to society. And if at this point in time, if I feel that I'm going to follow public sector, not to say there are a lot of people also that are in public service, that are also doing well, even at the lower ends, of course, but it's crowded by the generality of the people that are not doing well. But for me, given my skills, my background, I feel that working in a space, in a think tank space, contributing to knowledge production and helping people with education is something, the way to go for. But generally, I think it's ultimately a choice by the individual to decide where his or her skills can be best harnessed to serve the people that he or she want to serve. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a complex situation and one that's hard to navigate for every person deciding what's the best way to go forward.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things, about Africa as a whole, I mean, it's a very big continent with a lot of different countries. I think, many people talk about Africa as having, some of the most genetic diversity in the world. Can you describe sort of how the different parts of Africa are politically and in terms of development and governance?
Oh, that's a tough one, but we will try. So, like you said, Africa is diverse and difficult to pinpoint. But then, if you take issue of development, currently we have 23 low-income countries. We also have 23 lower middle income countries, and then the rest are upper middle income countries, with the exception of Seychelles that was high income country. I think the COVID reversed it, but I don't know if that been restricted by. So you have this diverse sort of, even in terms of the geography, you realize that the Northern Africa is far more developed than the sub-Saharan Africa. So when you are talking about issues of poverty, issues of hunger, they are mostly at the sub-Saharan African level. And at the sub-Saharan African, you can talk about Central Africa, that is the least developed, and maybe Southern Africa, that is the most unequal. So if you take a country like South Africa, it's developed, but then it's unequal. Okay. But Central Africa generally has most of the poor countries within it. West Africa is also now going through its own evolution in terms of governance and other things. Broadly, when you talk about governance, I mean, different African countries are struggling with different challenges of governance. And there are countries that are still struggling with security issues, mostly. There are countries that are struggling with internal wars, conflict, and terrorism, and what have you. There are still countries that are still fighting to keep the state together, to protect its territorial integrity. So you can talk about conflict in South Sudan, all those Somalia, and all of those countries. So they are basically struggling at that level to be able to put their security together, to be able to resolve conflict. And that is the basic form of governance. You need to put security first before you can be able to think about anything else.
Right.
So if you look at evolution of governance worldwide, or in Europe or the West or wherever it is, it started with a building of a strong security component through wars or world conquests. And then there was a form of security that was built. Then you move on to building capacity. By capacity, I mean being able to translate policy into action, building institutions that can deliver, building what do you call it, rule of law and all of that. So there are countries also in Africa that have been able to transition from the poor security or the insecurity to some bit of stability. And the challenge now is being able to build capacity to deliver, because ultimately it's about development. Yeah. So you talk about countries like Ghana, what do you call it, Nigeria, all these West African countries. Some are dealing with security challenges on their own, like Mali and other things that is contributing to, but then there are other countries also that have been a bit stable, but the capacity to deliver is not there. So in terms of governance, you see that they are struggling in that area. So accountability is an issue. corruption is a big problem because the state does not have the capacity to enforce rule of law. And you have politicians or leaders that are triumph over this state, if you like, because accountability does not work. So those are kind of, and then of course you have countries that also seems to be a bit stable. They have done well in terms of the capacity, as mostly the North African countries, but they need more inclusion to be more included, if you like it, democracy and human rights issues and other things. Okay, so that is how I will characterize different African countries in terms of governance. Some are at the basic level of security, some are struggling with the capacity, the ability of the state to manage its affairs, and some are still struggling with inclusion. That is not to say that it's mutually exclusive or others are not. I'm just trying to paint a picture of where countries are struggling the most at the moment, and maybe, if you like, a priority should be there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you did a good job of summarizing sort of as a whole what's going on in Africa. Is I think, if you don't live in the continent, it's very hard to understand the complexities. It's such a big place, and there's so many different people there. So that definitely helps a lot, I think, sort of get a picture of what's going on. And so what would you say then? I know you mentioned corruption as being an issue at times. Obviously wars can be an issue if there's civil wars in different countries. What are the things causing poverty the most in Africa right now?
That the issue of poverty is also a big question to answer, but I will try. I will try and then I will try and then give a frame to my answers. Of course, governance is one I've already mentioned, so maybe I wouldn't belabor the point. Governance, conflict, peace, and security. But I think if I'm supposed to talk about other causes of poverty, first of all, I mean, the continent itself is not poor. I mean, Africa has about 30% of the mineral resources in the whole world. It has 25% of agricultural land globally. So the continent has the ability to be able to transform itself. We have had bad leadership over the years. But in terms of the causes, I think the first one is the inability of leaders to transform the structure, the structure of our economy. And let me explain further. Maybe let me be more clear. What I mean is that most African economies are commodity dependent, and so when you talk about economic growth in Africa, mostly it's commodity driven, it's oil driven, it's gold driven. So Ghana produces a lot of gold. If gold prices increases, or if Ghana discover a new oil field, suddenly you see that the growth projection is going very up, and most other countries. So our economies in the colonial times, the economies that Africans have were commodity driven to feed industrial revolution in the West. So we export raw materials, raw gold, raw diamond, raw cocoa, raw rubber, cotton, what have you, to feed the industrial revolution in the West or elsewhere. Now, that has not changed since that time. Post-colonial, that has not changed. And for me, that is fundamental, because if you are always exporting your raw materials, or you have an economy that is commodity dependent, then the growth that the growth that comes as a result of that, that export becomes jobless growth. So there are no jobs that are associated with that growth, because there are not so many people that can be employed in just exploiting gold or what have you. They don't create jobs. Two, your economy becomes dependent on world market fluctuation. commodity fluctuation. So anytime there was a major crisis, your economy, so we've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the global financial crisis, and even the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war. Because we are commodity driven, our economies are so fragile and undiverse. Our economy is not diverse enough. So when there is a little shock to your major export, then you are struggling. That for me is one of the main causes of poverty that we need to address. The second one is the issue of population fertility rates and then demographic dividends, and if you like, human capital in general. We have one of the highest population growth. In fact, it is projected that by 2050, Africa will constitute a quarter of the world population.
Wow.
Now, this is a problem, what we call in the literature, you can have a demographic bump. We have a growing number of people that are turning up, that there are no opportunities, there are no jobs, there are nothing for them. Now, what this does is that you don't have a demographic dividend. Demographic dividend is the number of people, the number of working class that is taking, the number of dependent that is taken care of by the working class. Now, if you have a very high population growth, your demographic dividend will be very low. Remember China, when China wanted to develop, wanted to lift a lot of people out of poverty, it came up with this one-child policy.
Yes.
Yes, no, whether it's democratic or not, that one you can argue later. But the point is that with high population growth, every economic growth has to be shared by many people, if I'll put it this way. So if our economy grew by 5%, and you are 100 people, that 5% is going to share that 100, that 100 people is going to share that 5% growth. If you are 1,000 people, that 1,000 people is going to share that 5% growth. So if you have that kind of people that are being turned up every day, then there's a problem. A country like Mali with a very high fertility rates, Niger, the same thing. For every benefit of economic growth, the per capita, the income per capita reduces because of the high population growth and reducing the standard of living. So that is important. We need to take our demography serious so that we can have a demographic dividend. No country was able to develop without having a demographic dividend. The ratio currently Africa is just doing about 1:1. The ratio for demographic dividend is about 1.7. China peaked at 2 point something. Europe also the same thing. But we are still at that level. And that is an important component of being able to develop. The third reason I will give is the issue of agriculture. Agriculture and food security. No country can end poverty without ensuring food security. Because if you can't feed your people, you cannot develop.
Right, yes.
That is as basic as that. If you can't grow to feed your own people, then how can you, because food is a basic need. At the Maslow's theory of need, food is a basic level need. So for me, agriculture is been a problem. The fact that Africa has not been able to utilize its agricultural potential to have an agricultural revolution. We talk about a lot about agriculture, but we have never had an agricultural revolution. We are still using what you call low technology for agriculture. Basically, we don't see agriculture as a business. We just see it as some, some occupation to keep us. And that is important because you have close to about 85% of your population in the agricultural value chain. So if you don't transform agriculture, how are all these people going to survive? And if you're able to do that, then because you have a lot of people within the value chain, it improves their income, and then at least at the basic level, they have food to eat. they have food security to eat. Food security is a critical poverty issue. If you are not food secure, you cannot be able to do any other thing. So for me, we need to, what do you call it? The inability to transform agriculture is also a cause of our poverty. Look around, every country or every continent that developed is able to feed its continent. We have the potential, we have all the agricultural land, but we still import a lot.
Yep.
And a basic food become very expensive. African economies had to suffer greatly because of reliance on wheat and other things from Ukraine and Russia and other affected countries, because you are dependent on. Meanwhile, we have the capacity to be able to grow our own food and eat. And if you're able to grow your own food and eat, at least you solve the basic needs of people in their local communities. That for me is important. So I think if I'm supposed to talk about the cause of poverty, there are a lot. You can talk about African integration and the need for Africa to trade among itself. It's very critical also in ensuring broad economic growth, a broad shared economic growth. We need to integrate as a continent. We need to be able to have a larger market to be able to trade with ourselves, so that the African producer or manufacturer has a larger market and not just limited by one country or whatever. So African integration is key if we also want to be able to address the issue of poverty. I think the causes, I think I'll end, I'll probably stop here, and then if there are further questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a good summary of things going on, and just shows the complexity of all the different factors at play. And I think especially, when you were talking about like economic, the lack of diversification for the economy, and the need to be able to not be dependent on a resource that, as you said, fluctuates depending on the market from one day to the next. It's really interesting. So, what has been done to try to solve these problems? What countries perhaps are making improvements to deal with these issues?
Well, you're asking me very difficult, because African is very broad and very diverse.
I know there's lots of different countries.
It's quite difficult to give, but I mean, of course, there have been some efforts. Africa has made progress in terms of poverty eradication. Of course, everybody knows that Africa is not going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals on poverty. That is a foregone conclusion. But there has been progress in some countries. For instance, you can mention Rwanda. There have been progress even in Tanzania. There have been some progress if you check the poverty rate. Actually, I think a World Bank study in 2018 or so lists Chad, Tanzania, and some other countries as being able to make some progress. And recently, we have seen Rwanda also making some progress. So there are some progress. If you check Rwanda before the genocide and Rwanda now, it is not there yet, but there have been some progress that are being made over the years. So there are efforts on the continent to be able to develop that. But the question is, are this effort enough? That is the question for me. And most of this effort, don't forget, we have gone through an evolution of structural adjustment policy, poverty reduction program from the World Bank and the IMF. And these programs yielded some results, but they do not tackle the core, the core issues that affect people's life, the core issues that affect people's life. So for me, I think that, yes, there have been some progress. Some countries are doing well. I'm from Ghana, so if I don't mention Ghana is doing well.
That's right. Yeah, you're from Ghana, so that would make sense for you to mention that. Good one to mention.
We are doing well, but then I would say that the progress is not enough. Like I mentioned, if you look at the geographical distribution of poverty, then Northern Africa, for instance, has eradicated extreme poverty. poverty of $1.9. If you check, they have less than 3%, 1% of people there living in that kind of poverty. Broadly speaking, there are some countries like Seychelles, Mauritius, that are doing also extremely well in terms of Cape Verde, that are doing extremely well. There are no extreme poverties there. Yeah, so in that regard, there have been some progress in those countries. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what's it like for, different countries in Africa then trying to, when getting involved with like international trade and stuff, for example, I know that some countries have had some issues with like debt to China and stuff. They've had huge investments and they have trouble like paying off that, because it seems like there's a constant game of you have to be very careful about when you're dealing with international affairs, not to put your country in a situation that's going to make it very hard to get out of. So what's the impact of like, sort of foreign investments in Africa, and how do countries navigate that to ensure that, they're getting good deals that will be, helping the country going forward for the foreseeable future or not?
Yeah, so I mean, that is also a big question and a big conversation. So the external factors is also very much at play. Uh, for the likes of me, I like mostly to focus on the internal because I'll come to the external, but the point is that if you don't check your internal, you can never check the external.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
so that is a core thing too. But of course, one can also not discount the impact of global monopolies, the exploitations of global monopolies, and even countries that are in a way, in Nkrumah will call it neo-colonialism, that are extracting and exploiting resources from the African continent and using some means of manipulating African leaders and African continent into extracting their resources from the continent. I mean, if you take the issue of minerals extractions, for instance, you look at the contract that are signed and then you ask yourself, in God's name, I mean, how can you structure a mineral contract that, what do you call it? Most of the benefit does not go to the government, it goes to the private sector.
Yeah.
So, and that is one of the problem with African economies, because you export a lot of gold, you export a lot of what do you call it, oil, for instance, but the real returns on the oil does not go to the government, except for a few countries that have been able to manage their mineral resources well. Most African countries, the returns on those minerals don't go to the government per se. They only get royalties, taxes on them, but it goes to the global monopolies. So Ghana will export whatever barrels of oil, but then in the end, it goes to a global company, let's say Talo or whatever, the returns doesn't come to the government. So on paper, you are exporting, but the real returns of those exports goes to who? So mineral resource governance, for instance, is an area that we need to take critical look at, and then to stop the exploitations and all of that. Of course, there are some that have argued that the global financial architecture is not fair to the African countries. In terms of debt and all of those things, which I agree that there should be reforms in those areas to be able to give some breathing space to the African countries or leaders. Often we are in debt, and some of these things also some of these things have also been worsened by the Western ideologies. For instance, my country, Ghana, has been to the IMF 17 times. In most of the 80s and the 90s, the structural adjustment program, they told us our governments are ineffective, so privatize, and then we sold our industries and said we are privatizing, and then we privatize and give our industries and stuff to foreign entities, and they are basically the ones that make the profit and emit them out of our countries. And how do you build an economy like that? and you are told that when you go for instance, an IMF program, they will tell you that impose more taxes to collect more revenue, don't employ people, the conditionalities and those things. Meanwhile, the African continent is already struggling. If you impose more taxes, you're killing the economy because nothing is produced, nothing get produced. So some of these conditionalities and some of these unfavorable global terms of trade also affect development and affect poverty issues and growth issues in Africa. So I agree with that level, but I think that for a start, you need to fix your home first. That is where my focus is. Africa must fix its home. Yes, no foreign investor is, if you like, Father Christmas.
Right.
Everybody is seeking to what they can get. But if you fix your home and if you have your laws and you have your sovereignty, you determine who can exploit your resources and who cannot exploit your resources.
Yeah.
There are Chinese that are coming to Africa to do illegal mining and certain kinds of trade that Africans cannot go to China and do that.
Right.
So you ask yourself why. It's because we have not been able to fix our issues.
Yeah.
So for me, yes, in as much as we are calling on the global system to be fair, we have to make sure that we ourselves, we are positioning ourselves as a continent to be able to, take over. Because there are some, anyway, let me stop.
No, I mean, I think you're making lots of great points. I mean, I think that's kind of like the reality of the world as well. Like any country that wants to be able to develop and become a better country that's more organized and works better for all the people in it has to start with itself, because you're living in a world that is obviously, there's going to be competition between other countries for everything. That's just how it works. We organize ourselves into different countries and we're competing for resources. And so at the end of the day, if a country's, competing with you economically for something, they're going to look for their own interest to take care of their own people. And so you have to take care of yourself, first. That way you can ensure that you can grow and get, as you were saying, better deals internationally and I
think that is it, because
it's but yeah, it's really an interesting situation, because I mean, there's so much talent obviously in Africa, and there's so many people that could, are waiting to be able to, take advantage of the opportunity to really maximize all the resources and grow these countries' economies. But getting to that point is the challenge, as you've described many times now, and ensuring that there's a government that can
I think for me, there's the core issue is about the kind of leadership that we have on the continent. For me, that is at the core of the problem, because all these things we are talking about here today, if you ask an average African, we know our problems. We are not unaware of our problem. If you ask our leaders, they know the solutions to our problems. The reason they are not solving it is probably the problems benefit a certain group of people. Because we are not unaware of our challenges and we don't know the solution to our challenges. I did a quick glance some time ago at the head of central banks in Africa. And if you look at their profiles, they have worked at the IMF, they have worked at the World Bank, so these are very knowledgeable people. They are not people who are not uninformed. But how is it that suddenly when they get into position, then everything starts crumbling, they can't implement their own knowledge or something? So we have to fix the leadership paralysis on the continent as a start, because from our analysis, from where I work, our analysis and everything, to be able to develop as a low-income country or at an early stage of development, the critical factor is the development orientation of the governing elites. If the elites that are leading you are development oriented, then they are able to drive you in a certain direction with development plans that all countries or all the citizens commit to. And we have seen examples in whether if you like Singapore and all the Asian tigers. we've seen example. It wasn't about democracy or anything. It was the fact that they had leaders who were committed to ensuring that they left people out of poverty. We talk about China. It's the same thing. So for me, we have the resources. What we lack is leaders who are genuine, who are sincere, who are committed to lifting people out of poverty. For me, that is the crux of our issues, because all these things that I'm talking about, whether it's agriculture, whether it's commodity dependent, check manifestos of president or political parties in Africa. You will see all these things listed in them. So they are not new to them. There's nothing new. It's just the commitment to be able to deliver on this mandate. And that is, for me, is the issue.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a really hard challenge then, because when you're trying to find a political leader that's actually willing to do what they say they're going to do, I think every country has this issue. You know, the politician will say something, but whether they actually do it or not is a totally different story.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is a problem. I think the African continent, we have not been very fortunate. I mean, you can attribute a part of it also to how our state was formed from the beginning. The state was formed and the impact of colonialism and all of those things. Those undoubtedly play a role. If you look at the Francophone West African countries with the recent coups and everything that are happening there, you will see that people are basically tired of the French manipulations or the extraction of resources through their leaders or whatever that is there. Unlike Singapore and other places that they use those 30 years to transform their countries, they didn't do anything at all for their countries. They are still there. So for me, yes, every country has their own challenge and the nuances, and it may differ. But I think as a continent, we need to be able to look ourselves in the eye and our leaders and be able to hold them accountable for what is going on. That is why, for me, I like focusing on the internal and not the external, because you cannot have an external player. You cannot be an external player if you are not an internal player. If you have not solved your internal issues, yes, the external crises are there, of course, but then you have to, learn from other examples in the world, and then also fix your own issues.
Yeah, that's true. Because I mean, at the end of the day, no one's going to fix those problems for you. It's the country has to do it. And that's something that every country in the world will have to deal with when they're dealing with some problems. So that makes perfect sense. Now I'm curious, what are you currently working on then? What's your current research?
Well, my current research, so I do long-term modeling for African countries. So we look at drivers of human development in Africa. We build scenarios. So what we do is that we build scenarios on, let's say, on governance. If there was an improved governance, how does it affect poverty in the next 10 years? It does improve education. How does it, better education, how does it affect GDP? How does it? So that is what have occupied me for the past 2.5 years or so. We've done various studies, various countries. I just concluded a study on Mali. I'm wrapping up one on Senegal, and I've done for about 17 different countries and regions in Africa. So basically, we model all of these things. So that's what basically occupies me. That's why I look at structural changes, because that's what we do. We model them. So we look at 8 sectors. We look at agriculture. We look at education. We look at demographic and health. We look at free trade, manufacturing, and then we look at financial flows and then governance. These 8 sectors, we try to model an impact and look at maybe the African Union Agenda 2063 targets and see if it is realistic or not and what a country can do. So for instance, we take a country like Ghana. If the African Continental Free Trade Area is fully implemented, how does it affect Ghana's GDP in the next 10 or 20 years? How does it affect poverty in Ghana in the next 10 or 20 years? And just to say that when you do the analysis, you will see that in the short term, agriculture is a powerful driver to reduce poverty in Africa. An agricultural revolution is the most powerful driver to reduce poverty by 2033 if you do the analysis. And it makes sense because you have a lot of people employed in the agricultural value chain. So if you want to be able to feed people, you modernize agriculture. If you want to, because a lot of livelihoods depend on it. If Africa is able to cut its importation budget of food just even by half, it will save the economy a lot of foreign exchange. It will save the economy a lot of money that is used to import and it will create a lot of jobs within the local economy. So that is agriculture alone. Of course, you can talk about manufacturing. And manufacturing, I don't mean manufacturing of high-end manufacturing goods, low-end basic manufacturing commodities that we use day to day. You have to start small, low-end manufacturing goods, textiles, or these basic things that the African need themselves. They have to be able to manufacture them locally instead of always importing. Then we need to have the Africa integration. That is very important because if you have an African integration, free African movement, it creates a very big market for Africa. And it also drives investment into Africa. Why? Because if a company, for instance, wants to set up a manufacturing unit in Ghana, and Ghana is just about 30 million people, the company will, 30 million is not a big market if you take maybe active people, maybe about 15 million or whatever. But if you know that that company knows that if I set up in Ghana, and Nigeria is within ECOWAS, and there was free movement, there was free trade, there was free whatever it is, and I can access the Nigerian market. I can set up in Ghana and sell in Nigeria as well. So there is that advantage when you have a large market.
Yeah.
So if companies can set up a different part of Africa with the hope that they can benefit from other parts of the continent, the market in the other part of the continent. So those are things that you know that they can drive, they can drive structural change in the African economies.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, is there, what's the reason why countries in Africa are not trading with each other as much as would be beneficial for them? Is it just like government rivalries, or what's going on? Or
I think the issue of trade, first, of course, there was a colonial history to it that cannot be discounted. Every African country preferred to trade with their colonial masters. The French, the French Francophones trade with the French. The Anglophones trade with the English, and the Portuguese-speaking countries trade more with Portuguese. And then, of course, the Northern Africans also trade with their neighbors, the Middle East and what have you. That is one level. And the other thing is also the infrastructure.
Okay.
The infrastructure, inter-city or inter-country infrastructure within Africa, the connectivity within Africa. Just this morning, we had a session on technology and digital technology and innovation. And it is more expensive calling from Ghana to Ivory Coast than calling Ghana to the US.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And this is not just, I was in Ivory Coast in 2020 or 2019, I hope. I was just across the border calling Ghana, and it was more expensive than a call I made to Australia.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So how do you build? And yet, when you are in Europe or America, once you have a SIM and you're on roaming, every part of Europe it works.
Yeah.
Every part of America it works. But in Africa, it doesn't. The infrastructure also to be able to trade with each other. We don't have rails that connect African cities to each other. Flight from one African country is more expensive than flight to Europe. And in sometimes to be able to go to another African country, you have to go through Europe before you can go to the next African country.
Wow.
So ultimately, with such kind of infrastructure, you cannot integrate.
Yeah.
You cannot integrate one like, and then of course the border restrictions and all of those things that have been put in place. I came here with a Schengen visa, and by the Schengen visa, I'm able to visit, a lot of European countries, but with no question or anything. But once you are in Africa, to move to another African country, I work in South Africa. It took me 16 months to get a permit to work in South Africa.
Wow.
A process that was supposed to take 3 months. So with this kind of system in place, it's kind of difficult to trade with each other. And then, of course, there are arguments that we produce similar goods and what have you. But for me, that argument, I don't buy it, because Europe has an integration and what do you call it? It's also what do you call it? Trade similar goods in certain areas, but it's able to integrate. And the major issue is the lack of political will by African leaders to be able to unite and integrate. No African leader want to lose some sort of power or, if you like, sovereignty. But so they just decide that they will just play along. That is why the African Free Trade Area is progressing, but at a slow pace. And it's not every country is looking at what it can get. Of course, within every economic integration and every economic system, there are winners and losers in the short while, but ultimately, if it is done well, there can be redistribution. Then the other thing also is the monetary zone. We need an African monetary zone to be able to trade, because we all have different currencies that when you leave Africa, when you leave your country, is no longer relevant. Even if Ghana is trading with Cote d'Ivoire neighbor, have to trade in the United States dollars.
Yeah.
And that dependence on the dollar is also driving our economies into disarray, if you like, because we are always in shortage of dollars. We need more dollars. So we need an African monetary system. There has been the ECOWAS that was trying the ECO currency or what have you. The East African countries were also trying. It has been in discussion, but it never works. So these are impediments that these are things that hinders an African integration or trade. But for me, the ultimate is political will by our leaders. If our leaders are committed in ensuring that we trade, irrespective of all these challenges, they will be able to do it. It is not undoable. They are just not committed. So for me, if you go and look at the African Union, it has a lot of literature, it has a lot of policies, it has a lot of solutions and a lot of things written about how and why we should do it. So it's not a question of why and how, or we don't know how to do it. We know how to do it, but there's no political will to be able to do that.
So what would you say then, just wrapping up then, what's the best way for people to keep track of your work and follow you?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I think so I work at the Institute for Security Studies as a researcher with the African Futures and Innovation Program. We have our website, futuresafrica.org. that you can, we have In fact, if you Google that website, futures.africa.org, iss.org, you'll find report of every African country, income group, every region, and Africa as a whole, a report on it. And we are constantly updating these reports at every given point in time. So the reports are not static; they are updated as and when new information comes up and new issues come up. So we have report on every African country, and this report covers all the 8 sectors that I mentioned earlier, and it tracks the progress of the country, and we model scenarios on how the country can develop in the next 20 years. So you can find a lot of things there, and I've personally written about 17 of those reports and reviewed about 8 of them. So, and then there are constant blogs, of course, that we write on that. Aside that, also, of course, all my works, if you check my LinkedIn page, Enoch Aikins, you'll find all my articles. I have a lot of articles, at least on top of my head this year alone, I think about 10 of them on different issues in Africa. I've posted all of them. All of them are online, actually, basically.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, you can just find, if you go to the main ISS website, my name there, you see all my articles. Just last week, I had an article on election in Liberia. This week, another one on Guinea will come. Next week, I have another one on Ghana, and then maybe look for it. So yeah, as for my work, most of them, the surest place to find is if you check my LinkedIn, you will see that most of them are there. But otherwise, the website I've mentioned also hosts all our work, issafrica.org, and then futuresafrica.org, which is my department where I work. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. And are you on social media at all, like Twitter or anything, or?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not very active.
Not very
on
active.
Twitter.
Okay.
So
That's
yeah,
fine.
I don't. But once in a while, I tweet some of my work on Twitter, but not very active. Yeah, but my Twitter handle is also Enoch Aikins. I think Aikins at Aikins Randy. Something like that. So you can check me out. It's not a very active page like LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the main page that I engage people. But fine, Twitter is also there. Yeah, I'm kind of old school, maybe.
Sounds good. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
And so are you still part of the European University Institute?
Yeah, I'm currently in Florence. I'm
Okay,
currently in
got
Florence.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just trying to understand all the different things you were a part of. So
yeah. So I'm also I'm currently a fellow at the European University Institute here in Florence, the Young African Leaders Program. Yeah, I've been here for the past 2.5 months since beginning of September. Yeah, so I'm part of that as well. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge. Yeah, really fascinating topic, and one that, is definitely really relevant. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I don't know if I did a good job in analyzing the issues, but this is the little that I can I can see. And if there are any other clarification or anything that you need, I mean, definitely get in touch.